On in, and I will share my screen. Hopefully it'll get there. Oh, why is it not going? Share, do it. There we go. And there we go. I'm on the wrong side. We'll back out and go all the way to the top. Sorry, usually more slick than that. Well, welcome to the year 2021. I am so happy to be back with you guys at Westminster. Whether you're in Stover or online or you're watching this later, I'm so thankful to Becca and her support for this effort, what she and I started calling a Valencia College or Valencia at Westminster. And I'm just so excited to be sharing with you. She might tell you, I've already started bugging her about when can I come back? When can I come back in person? But I'm so pleased to be able to keep doing this. And I've got lots of really great plans for 21. I'm in conversation with about 6 or 7 of my peers, which actually it'll be better for them if we stay doing it by Zoom because it's a little easier for them. Who knows, maybe if we're able to come back in the summer, I still might have one of them use Zoom. I'll physically come and be with you like I love doing, and we'll watch them through Zoom. But my friend Brian Macon, Professor Macon, who's a mathematician, is looking at doing some history of some core concepts of math. My friend Professor Borglum, who's been with us a couple of times, is going to come back and is working or trying to work on a series on the late 19th century American authors. So that same period we covered last fall. Professor Bryson is looking to come back again. She's working on some material. Professor Robinson, who you may remember came and did one day when we looked at the fall of the Roman Republic. And I've asked him to come back and maybe consider doing a 3 or 4 part series on the Roman Empire. So really slowing down and going a little deeper into the empire itself, which could be actually several points. And then I've got several topics that, I love being with you guys and I'm honored to be there. And so I've got other topics to fill the gap in. What we're going to do to start with, though, for this first 3 weeks is address something you asked me about when I first started. When I first started, if you were here then, maybe some of you weren't, but if you were here then, I said, as I said multiple times, I really want this to be something that you find enjoyable and perhaps at times answering questions that you have related to topics from history. I certainly am not an expert I'm not an expert in many things, but I'm certainly not an expert in all fields of history. So there may be some things that you ask about I just can't do well. But one of the things that was asked, and one time we passed a sheet of paper around and several people filled things out, and I'll pause and say, you always can ask me by email directly. I'll give you my email. In person, certainly you can shout out and maybe I can hear you, or you can ask Becca to send it to me. If you had a topic that you would love for us to cover that we haven't covered, and then we've been going now we're in our 3rd year, and I may loop back around at some point and do some one topics that we did early on. But if you have a topic, I'd love to know, because I want to try to deliver for you not only compelling lectures and information. That's why I'm really picky about who I invite to come and speak to us, but also ideas and topics that are interesting to you. Some of the topics that we've done over the 2.5 years or so we've been together are ones that somebody in the group said, hey, please cover this. So early on, I was asked by more than one person, 3 or 4 different topics that could be lumped into the same area, and basically asking about the earliest history of the humans. A couple of different people asked, could I do something relative to religion? And certainly that's something that I want we're going to tiptoe into. So that idea of looking at the human and the human species is the way I kind of like to say it, to kind of gets us away from thinking perhaps of one people group, but a more broad understanding of the species in total. We're all one, regardless of one's faith position or lack of faith position or how you look. We're still part of the biological world, right? And so we are a species. And I think that both biologically and sociologically, there's aspects that we can learn from our ancient days. In fact, and so I'll use this as a small segue, what we saw yesterday, again, hopefully for me watching, you were one, if you've been in any of our sessions, particularly if you've been with me for the whole time I've been together, hopefully you were not surprised yesterday. So I'm talking about the attack on the Capitol, where the Capitol was invaded, I think is a fair way to put it. Whether those people actually had a serious plan, all those people, or whether it was just sort of a mob action that got further than they thought they would get, I don't know. Nonetheless, it was deeply disturbing to watch. Yet it should not have been surprising, because I've been with you in particular talking about the kind of the larger scope of what we've seen over a 500-year pattern in our history, but what we'll talk about even a little bit tonight, but more the next two nights. This idea of a people becoming dissatisfied with their experience and then deciding to act is not a new concept. Those who disagree with them can feel like they're acting unwisely or poorly or in a way that is, why would they do that? That I totally understand. That I respect. But there's a sense in which if we could sort of step back and put ourselves maybe in the role of we were just observing from Mars, we would say, well, these people don't all agree on how to move forward. And so, at least as observers scientifically, which in one sense what a historian is, you just don't have an opinion, you're just kind of observing what happens. You can sort of go, oh, I get it. I don't think I would have joined them, or I disagree perhaps even strongly with why they did what they did, whether we're talking about yesterday in the Capitol, the 2020 election, or whether we're talking about things from 300-400 years ago. In those moments, we want to say it's not an odd, unique, or unseen, unforeseen kind of event. And, as we sit here the day after in early January of 2020, I would just suggest that one needs to be ready and prepared for other, actions and steps that will occur as they go along. And we'll see what transpires. I'm hopeful that the inauguration will go off cleanly for President-elect Biden, and then we'll watch what goes from there, kind of a thing. So what we're going to do over these three sessions is we're going to step all the way back to antiquity and see how these lessons, like the one that I suggest, that is a common in the human, that there are times when the human, having lived, we would say peacefully within a certain civic structure, after a while decides they don't like it anymore. We know from our own history, that's exactly what 1776 was. A group of people living within the civic structure that was functioning. It was actually quite liberal. It was actually economically strong, but a group of people decided they didn't like it anymore. And they acted against it. And then they contrived a narrative to explain themselves. So, win in the course of human events. Well, that's a crafted narrative that the winners got to tell of their story of what happened in 1776. Had they not won on the battlefield and in the political arena, diplomatic arena, by 81, 82, a very different story would be known today about what happened in 1776, and maybe few people would know the opening lines of our Declaration. Well, to understand those things, I would contend, and this is what I tell my students, you have to go and get the foundation of society in antiquity. Now, when we teach Western civilization, we teach it in 2 courses. We probably should teach it in 3, but we teach it in 2 courses. And the first course is the largest sweep. So it's the ancient and medieval, which goes all the way back to where I'm going to start you today and comes all the way through 1648. And then the modern one is 1648 to present. So basically it's both halves of American history put into one area, right? So what I tell the students is when you take modern Western Civ, the benefit of taking modern Western Civ or modern US history, but modern Western Civ, is that you gain an understanding as to why the world looks the way it looks today. Again, when we say understanding, we're not saying that you would gain some awareness that it's right or best. That's in the eye of the individual beholder. And when you look at the world today, the world in 2020 is a world built around values and concepts from Western civilization. So human rights, voting, citizen participation, constitutions, these are all things that were, if not unique, most strongly stressed within the Western historical story. And for now, at least, the Western world's ideas from Western Civ dominate. That's why I tell my students it's still worthy to study Western Civ as opposed to saying, why don't we study world history? Well, that's worthy also, but there's a reason for studying Western Civ. Well, if that's true, and I sometimes describe it like you were born, and when you were born into a house. There's already a house there. You didn't have to build the house. You were just born, and voila, there's a house around the world of a certain set of values, certain set of principles. The structure's already up. It's got a roof, it's got AC, it's all set. Now, as you age, you might add on, you might change something, you might paint something differently. That's cool, that's fair. But when you're born into it, you didn't build it. It already existed. And that's the world we find ourselves as we're born into it. But a house is built on a foundation. And so what the other Western Civ class, the ancient and medieval class, provides for students is an understanding of that foundation. Like, what is the foundation upon which the Western world, Western civilization house was built? And so that's kind of what we're going to be working our way through in a 3-part series. We're going to look tonight at kind of understanding the first part of antiquity, and in particular, how do historians know anything, which is, it's a pretty strong, bold statement, which I'll go into more depth, for a historian to say, oh, this happened 5,500 years ago. And then the next session, next week, we'll be talking about what are some of those common lessons and what are those major themes that we can glean to understand the world today that we can see coming from our forebears across the globe in the various things that happened over the past 5,500 years. And then, and again, this is a topic you guys asked me for. And then on our third series, we're going to talk about why in particular does the species draw to the idea of religion. And we'll look just briefly at some of the ancient religions that exist around the world. We're not going to go super deep into any one of them, but I think that, again, that was a question more than one person asked, and so we're going to try and touch base with it. So that's kind of the plan for the rest of January, and then we'll see how my other peers come along and either say, hey, I'd like to do my topic at this time, or we'll keep going. I've got some ideas of what I want us to do for that. I will fill in from there. So you understand antiquity. When we talk about antiquity, we're talking about going to the original starting spot of history. Now, it's really important for you to understand that there is a difference between history, the field I'm in, and anthropology. Now, in one sense, of course, everything's history, as we've said multiple times. But when you say there's a field of history that deals with what historians do, historians, as I'm going to show you in a minute, are trying to deal with the narrative that we can know. Whereas anthropologists are going further back into, say, the mist, right? So this is why if you Googled like the flow of history within the world, you would find that there are, depending on which site you go to, epochs, E-P-O-C-H, or ages that people list before the Bronze Age. History and historians start with the Bronze Age. Now, this is a day in particular. Gosh, I wish I was with you guys, because I would want to ask you questions and I'd want you to give it to me. So the question is, well, why? Why the Bronze Age? And it's because it's with the Bronze Age that we get to language in a written format. Prior to the Bronze Age, and we do, or at least I do, accept that we have received and found various archaeological pieces that predate the Bronze Age, right? So using all the different kinds of scientific dating that they can come up with, and understanding, when they do a dig, how far down are they going, all those pieces. I accept the fact that either this bone or these artifacts that they've discovered, piece of pottery, so and so, it can be before this period. But as a historian, what I would tell you is we don't know anything about it. At best, we can say, yep, we're in a cave, and there's some drawings of what looks like humanoid people attacking what looks to be like some kind of an animal, maybe a very large elephant. And that's not made up. It's not something that somebody, created as a scam. It's really there, and it's really dated to before this period. But what we cannot do as historians, at least, is then write a narrative beyond that. That's why I kind of get frustrated when I watch some PBS specials and the anthropologists are on there and they're saying, oh, and these people did this, and these people did this, and these people. I'm like, you can't say any of that, because all you have is some pottery shards, maybe a weapon, some bones, maybe some walls, those kinds of things. It's not saying people didn't exist. It's just we can't say anything about it. So when a historian looks at the period, you kind of walk down this kind of a grouping, right? So 33 BC, and again, all these years, think of them as, ish, sort of around that time period, right? So the early antiquity, ancient age, the Bronze Age, 3300, and that's usually cast more with the onset of written language than with the actual use of bronze, although bronze usage is in that ballpark. About 2,000 years of time rolls by. No great, I'm gonna show you some locations in a minute. There's not a lot of, there's no evidence of other peoples in great numbers in that 2,000 years. But as you're moving in to, say, the 1700s, moving down, remember in the BC era, we moved down to zero as opposed to going up. You begin to pick up more people groups, and this kind of ties in because of Western civilization. These ages often get connected to Greece and to Rome, Athens and Rome, where we've been just recently in December. So you kind of have an Iron Age, which is really kind of the period of the end of the Trojan War, the Mycenaean Age, the smaller city-states. Then there's kind of the Greek Dark Ages, and then you come into classical antiquity, which kind of covers both Athens and Rome, which we talked about in December. And again, if Professor Robinson can come join us, we'll go deeper into the Roman Empire, into the AD window, the fall of Rome, mid-400s, depends on how you want to pick the spot. Then a broadly medieval period. Then the way I look at it is kind of an early modern Renaissance. Please understand, you could have 5 other historians and they would give you maybe some different names, some different nomenclature, and some different dates. They might quibble on the dates, and I would not quibble, just kind of very loosely, yes, this is broadly where we are. I love the Renaissance, which I've told you, we did the Renaissance last year in the spring. And so I put the Renaissance in there. Others would not. They would just sort of generally say there's a modern age. And then some would say that there's an age where modern sort of stops, and in like the 1800s, 1900s. And so you get, pickiness. The closer we get, sometimes you'll get, well, there's the Reformation age, and then there's the Enlightenment age, and then there's the Scientific Revolution age. And so all that's fair. All that's just to say that there's this kind of long history that and when you look back at our civilizations, again, we connect it back to language. Now you'll notice as you look at this, that this moves over again, almost a 2,000-year period. I like to include the Olmec peoples down in 1500-ish. There are some historians and archaeologists who would actually date the Olmecs into 2000, maybe even ahead of the Chinese societies that existed around the Yellow River. But so these people groups, this is our evidence that we have of societies that are emerging. We'll look next week at a little bit kind of what are some of the clues about civilization, but you're not surprised that civilization needs water. So you find all of our societies initially existing only around water, nearby water, fresh water. Now the Olmec peoples, there's no major river through Central America that they existed by, and they were like the Minoan peoples, a fishing kind of people. So for the Olmecs, and so here's a map for you. So look down here at this bottom map. This is Central America, and this orange down here is where the Olmec people are. This is, of course, the world, and you can see it's really clearly marked out, the 4 great cradles of civilization it's often, described as. But the Olmec peoples here, and then right here is Crete. And so these Aegean Sea islands was where the Minoan culture was located. And so the Minoan culture over here, I think you can see my cursor, and then down here, the Olmec peoples, they didn't really exist by a major river. They certainly existed by rivers, but they were a fishing people. And so they're in that Bay of Campeche, in the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico, the eastern part of Mexico today. The Olmec peoples were able to design their civilizations. So all these people kind of, construct a society around early life. And it is in that early civilizations that we then can see lessons that emerge. Right? We were able to learn and glean different things from what we see that they wrote for themselves. And it's possible, let me go back to this map for a second. Let me go back to this. It is very possible that there are other peoples that should be on this list. And it's also possible that, say, when you look, for instance, at the Chinese societies, it's possible that there was an existence of them prior to 2000 BC, but because there's no written language, again, we don't know them. I think I've told you this before. I think it just bears repeating. It's a little joke that I like. You remember from your science classes, the old kind of statement from scientists, if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? And it's a joke, right? And of course, the answer is, of course, it makes a sound, even if nobody's there to hear it, because sound waves are produced. Right? We know that. So I've always spun that and say, as a historian, if a tree falls in a forest and no one wrote down that there was a forest, would the tree have ever existed? And the answer is no, it never exists. It gets lost to us. It's gone. So there may be other groups that should be on this list. It's possible that this map needs more colors, maybe up in here or over here in Europe, or up here on the Mississippi River, which of course we know there are peoples who emerge in the last, say, 1,000 years. For sure we know this on the Mississippi River Valley. The Mound people, M-O-U-N-D. So we have these places up the Mississippi River, and to some degree on the Ohio, where you have mound civilizations that suggest some sort of civic life. But when we don't have anything written down, we kind of just go, well, we don't really know. So what we can find when we look at the societies that we know is that, as I'm going to, again, I've made the point already once, is that the human has not changed or hasn't changed much. It's interesting, there are times when you see people, this has been stated recently, it's certainly been stated prior to our own day, about societal changes and values, and someone saying, well, you should be on the right side of history, or history, and the suggestion is that history is changing, and there's a lot of things that have changed and morphed over time. And there are some, right? There clearly are some. And at the same time, there are many things that have not changed in the least about the human, either as individual species, certainly as biological change, there's just hardly any that you could point to. And then I think as a sociological construct, from a sense of how people's work in concert together, when you live in a civic society in a geographical enclosed space, so around the Nile River, right, around the Tigris and the Euphrates River. So you're living in a certain space around, as we saw for the Greeks, around a certain river or area in the Greek peninsula, right? The Romans building in a certain space around these certain hills. They're not really mountains, but hills protecting the city, right? So there's a civic geographic space. And when you look at those and then you look at us today, I would suggest that there's just not a lot of changes. Well, now, this then raises the question of how does a historian know any of that? And I usually do this on the first day of class with my students because when you're in a history class, you're kind of always working uphill. Unlike you, you have some interest in history. That's why you keep coming, and I'm just so happy that you come. Other people don't like history, which is fine. And certainly as a student, many times I've had students tell me that their experience prior was very boring, or the professor just sort of read from the book, or a bunch of names and dates to memorize, and that it's not engaging. And I usually contend that's just very poor teaching, because the story of the human is fascinating. Her journey through time is just, there's heroes and villains and victories and tragedies. And this is why we like the stories and the movies, stories we read and movies we watch, because it's really just reflecting the human, pageant. But to help my students in the Antiquities class, because it's a fair question to go, wait a minute. I understand we can know something. We've got these pictures, we've got maps, we've got videos in the year 2020, with people with their smartphones recording things, but how do you know something happened? And so I think it's fair to spend some time kind of talking through what is it that historians do to help kind of explain that. So the work of the historian is to discover evidence on previous events, and I should have probably typed in here, in order to construct a narrative, right? That there's a story of what happened, either for this individual or for this town or for this company or for this war or for this political moment. And so the job of the historian, again, think of the trees in the forest and nobody ever writes them down, so they just cease to exist, is to find that evidence about them. Here's another moment when I wish we were together, because we talk about like, well, what is the evidence? What would be the things that you would want to come up with? And of course, the working definition of history kind of builds on this, right? So it's our knowledge of the past, so there's that narrative, based on testimony. So think of every piece of evidence as like a witness in a courtroom, right? So they're bringing up different witnesses to tell the story. So our knowledge of the past based on testimony. No testimony, then you don't know. You just go, I don't know. I don't know what happened, because there was no witness to it. Knowledge of the past based on testimony, based on what witness we have to the events. And that's why this period we're looking at, the Bronze Age, is kind of so important, because it's at this period where there's writing that we begin to have both actual early documents and eventually men and later some women who will write down these stories. So there's a course you could take as a historian, you typically do for grad school, called Histography, which basically is a class studying the actual historians. And we're not going to go down this rabbit trail, but these names here are among the real great, large, powerful names within the historical field of these people who took time to write. And you may, of course, remember that with history, there's primary sources and secondary sources, and a primary source is, like a letter or a diary, and a secondary source would be like something Herodotus would write, when he would say, this is the history. And we're like, glad we have it. We're glad he explains it. So Herodotus, for instance, is who gives us the best picture that we have of the Greco-Persian War. And obviously he gives a pro-Greece perspective. So Xerxes, for instance, or Darius comes off really kind of dark in a negative kind of way. But these guys writing, in one sense, are giving us a secondary source, because we can say that we can study what did Herodotus or Thucydides or Xenophon, what do they write? And then in our own day, as we discover, more documents and more information and more witness, more evidence, we can begin to add to their story. And so, for instance, we're able to see that Herodotus is writing from a certain perspective and perhaps stilting the version of what Xerxes is. Not surprisingly, right? He's a Greek, and he's obviously writing it from a perspective of a pro-Athens, in particular Athens, point of view. And so as you kind of walk through, these are some of the great figures who provide us this information. So the evidence is crucial for us. If we don't have the evidence, we don't have the story as I've already made it. The types of evidence that we need, or that we typically find in antiquity in particular, are written evidence and physical evidence. And from here, what we're doing is we're, again, constructing that narrative based on probable certainty. That's why I've often said a good historian, if she could do it, would just end almost every paragraph with the phrase, as best we know the evidence. Because there's a sense in which you and I both know that there is always lost evidence. And that's true in our own day. And it's true, obviously, further back that you go. And clearly, the further back we go, the more limited the evidence becomes. And we get into places where we really can only lean on, say, someone like Cato or someone like Tacitus. And we say, well, we know what Tacitus wrote. Like, for instance, Julius Caesar wrote an account. So it's an eyewitness account. It's an autobiographical account of his war with the Gauls that occurred in the 1st century BC. It's a very important work for us in history, both of understanding Rome, but also understanding the Celtic peoples. It's one of the few document writings we have of the Celtic peoples, in this case, specifically the Gauls. But clearly, Caesar wrote it from a pro-Roman Julius Caesar point of view. So as modern historians, we have to understand that there's a slant to that, and that there may be more of the story, more of the narrative that we simply don't have as we build the story. So we're looking for our probable certainty, but understanding we're limited by our evidence. So the types of evidence, as I said to you already, and again, I wish you could give me this too, is written. The written evidence is the main thing. In fact, I brought some books here to show you. This happens to be Machiavelli's writing on the Prince. I have many others at the office that I would want to show you. Here's a couple of books that have writings from the 1st and 2nd century, kind of a 200 BC to 200 AD. This, in fact, I've opened it to a page where Josephus, who is a gentleman on the list, who was a Jewish man who wrote for the Romans around what's called the Jewish Wars or Antiquities. And so, we read this, and I'm no longer reading what a historian thinks. I'm reading what Josephus actually wrote. Right before this was back over here with some writings from Tacitus. And so, here, these are some of the writings from the 1st century Christian leaders. So they're giving us a view of the Roman Empire in its 1st century, kind of from their perspective. And so these ancient documents are the primary source. So the written word is vital for us. Again, why do we start with the Bronze Age? And there's both kind of official documents, letters, information that we have, the laws that are written, personal accounts, and then there's eyewitness accounts, which are kind of diaries. Like I said, Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars is a version of that, where it's an eyewitness reporting of what he experienced. Late Roman Republic historians have diaries and writings from soldiers who were with him, from other political figures who were around at that time. So that's able to you kind of fold that in together as historians to then construct the narrative of what was going on in the 1st century. Then, of course, there is the physical evidence. It's in one sense, you can think of the written evidence as kind of like the first line of your best witness, right? So you've seen enough law TV shows to understand that sometimes they've got really good eyewitness accounts and this is the best person. And then they've got other witnesses who are going to come in and corroborate what happens. Like they might have a medical expert who didn't have anything to do with the case, but in answering certain questions, she's able to explain why this happened a certain way, and then that suggests this kind of a murder or this kind of a scientific thing that then the lawyer is going to use to build their case. Physical evidence typically found through archaeology, is this. In one sense, think of archaeology as presenting us evidence and aspects of the existence of the human, where the human has been, what they've done, things that they've done. So it can be everything from a large thing like a city, down to walls of buildings, different writings. There can be inscriptions on walls, down to smaller pieces, tools, pottery, utensils. I don't know if you've ever gotten to travel. So for instance, you may have gone some places. When I took some students to Italy, we visited Pompeii, which is still an active archaeological site. They're still bringing out materials, finding new rooms. It's fascinating kind of work to look at. When I took my daughters to Jamestown, I accompanied them as a parent on a student trip. In Jamestown, they're constantly doing archaeological work and digging up information. So they'll find things like pottery and bones. When I took my kids to Mount Vernon, again, similarly there. And so for instance, in Mount Vernon, there was an area that's a kids' activity area, and they had pieces of a pot that the kids could put together. I think it was probably a replica, but nonetheless, they got the experience of saying, oh, you found these 5 or 6 pieces, what can you make? And they had tape, and so the girls kind of put together a version of a plate. And so that plate doesn't say anything, but it's a corroboration to the idea that some humans lived there and had a tool, which is what a plate is, by which they would have held something wasn't deep, so it couldn't be a water-based thing like a soup, but it held something on it. And that's what it tells us. And when you have written evidence, you kind of tie that all in together. Other types of evidence that we use would be paintings, murals. These can be paintings that are done after the fact. So I think with the French Revolution, when we did that study, I showed you some of the wonderful paintings of David. And so he's obviously painting under, at least later, under Napoleon's direction. So you watch it. There's a way you look at David's painting from an art perspective, from an art appreciation perspective, and you can love it and be amazed. And of course, these are gigantic paintings, covering an entire wall, like 40 feet by 20 feet. They're stunning to walk in. But there's also a historical aspect to it, right? Because that's actually Napoleon, that's actually the Pope, there's actually Josephine, there's all these people that are in the story. Then you're not sure how much of this is David giving us a depiction that he gleaned from other witnesses, or that Napoleon shaped it. Most art historians believe Napoleon shaped it somewhat. So you have that helpful. Oral history is very important. Now, usually oral history gets to us in a written format. So if I came and wanted to get a history of the residents of Westminster, and I did oral history with you, I would sit with each one of you, and we would take hours, and I would ask you questions, and you'd tell me stories. I'd love that. But what would I do with that? Well, I'd have it recorded, and then what would I do? I would write it down, and it'd be into a written document. So when we say oral history, and you think about antiquity, you may say, well, obviously there's nobody alive from 5,000 years ago. But what we do is we are in a place where we can there are writings and recordings of oral history. And oral history has got its own questions and considerations, but on the main, most historians, I certainly do, hold that oral history plays a vital role in giving us a witness, and in some cases, the best witness to what happened in a certain place and a certain people. And since we mentioned religion, religion kind of falls into its own category. It's obviously, you'd have in aspects of religious worship, both written and physical evidence. But because religion is so important to the human, and throughout, as we'll see in 3 weeks or 2 weeks from now, how strong there is throughout the globe, all peoples, all continents, some aspect of worship, we find a heightened or a higher percentage of information about a people that comes through aspects of worship. Now, of course, in modern times, we add to this photographs and recordings, audio recordings and video recordings. And so this makes, say, from 1850 to now, so it's only 150 years, it makes that job a different struggle. I've told you before, if antiquity, the challenge is you have a very thin line, or to use an aquatic example, you've got a faucet dripping every 5 minutes. You're still getting water. It's just, it's not a lot. Well, particularly once you get past World War II or get to the 1930s, 1940s, the evidence for historians is a flood. It's like drinking out of a fire hose. So it's got its own challenges. Now, so when we look at written documents, it's really important to understand what this means. We have no original copies of something prior to the 1100s. So I just showed you, for instance, Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli, the Prince, is written in the 1400s. I believe we do have original copy of this, like the copy, like Machiavelli with a pen writing. It's at the same time as the printing press. The printing press changes the story for historians. We do have in the 1100s and after. So we have in the 1100s, there's some poems and some music that we have original copies. And so it begins to pick up speed. Well, this thing raises questions for us. If we're going to claim Julius Caesar fought a war in modern day France, destroying or defeating the Gauls, and that there was a people there called the Gauls in, say, 75 BC. Well, on what proof? Well, you've got his Gallic Wars. But if someone says, well, wait a minute, you don't have the original, how do you know that wasn't just somebody made that up, right? You weren't there. Like all the things we read, do I have my history book with me? I don't think I have my copy. My textbook's back in another room. I was going to hold it up for you. But everything you read in a textbook of history, right? Or you read in the Britannica about antiquity, or even of the 1600s. Like none of you have seen George Washington. I mean, I know there's a painting of George Washington. I've been to a house that I was told George Washington lived in, but I didn't see him personally. And there's no film. So the question that is fair to ask is, well, how do you know? I mean, how can you prove that? And again, so the role of the historian is detective. It is a sense of trying to comprise information by which we then glean and construct this narrative. So when we don't have the original, we'll have copies. These pictures that you're looking at are actual pictures, just for example, of when we talk about there being a copy of a manuscript. That's what we're talking about. It's everything from the central picture, which looks like a very robust book, right, of one writing, to the two pictures on the sides there, which you can see, one looks like 2 pages, and then one looks like it may be nothing more than a 2-inch by 2-inch square. But of course, it's got writing on it. And there in history, there are people who go into the field, kind of a blurring of archaeology and history, called textual work or textual experts. And these are usually an archivist. They will become experts in a language and in a time. And they will begin to know, even with something like that one there on the right, the small little fragment, right? They would be able to read that, know what words are there, put it through some scientific testing, test the material that it's written on, test the writing ink that was used, and begin to, as a detective, determine where this came from and when. And then being an expert in the language, many times, particularly with antiquity, because there's so few documents, they can become experts in knowing the various documents. And sometimes they can see just as that looks like there's like 4 or 5 words on that piece of little manuscript. And they would know, oh, that's from this. And so then that gives us a copy. So what this does is it gives us copies by which we can begin to reconstruct the original. So again, I'm gonna hold you up, Machiavelli, or actually me hold since I mentioned Josephus in here, Josephus is writing here around 100 AD, right? You can't read it obviously, but just, can you see it? Oh, it's just blank. There you go. Kind of turn it from the, get it off the light. Anyway, when this is written for modern readers, right? A person could ask, well, how do you know that's what Josephus wrote? You don't have the original. So what historians and experts do is that they have copies that are written, and from the copies, we're able to reconstruct the original. Now, so then this is how we build what we call historicity. How can we know this is a trustworthy piece of information? How do we know Caesar actually wrote the Gallic Wars and fought in the wars, right? So we know that by two ways, right? There's two things that we do that we're kind of judging and building our trust in what the document, the copies show us. And one is the more copies we have, the better. And the other is the length of time. Now, the first one hopefully makes sense on its face. If I only have 3 copies, then I can't know for sure, particularly if they disagree in writing, and sometimes you might find different misspellings or different spellings of words or names. And it's supposedly the same document, but it's not identical. Well, how do I know which spelling is correct? Sometimes there's not an error like somebody's lying about something, but maybe there's a place where a person, when they're copying this, they might have skipped a line. And you and I think, well, I wouldn't skip a line if I was copying a document today. Well, no, one, you have eyeglasses, you have bright light, and you're probably copying one document once and take you 15 minutes. But imagine you did that for 10 hours straight, and you did it in the dark, and it was really like this, and it was kind of murky, and you couldn't see very well, right? And you were doing that for hours on end, and you don't get to wear your glasses like I have. So it's kind of blurry, like I can't really see well. Well, that, of course, is the world of the ancients and the scholars who would be recording it, the scribes who'd be writing and recording stuff. So the more copies we have, the better. Then secondarily, when do we have our earliest copies? So let me show you a chart just to understand this, right? So here's some of our best, most famous documents. And you can see by this that there's different times we say, like, we know Plato wrote somewhere in the late 400s. But our earliest copy that we've ever found is dated to 895, so around 1300 years, right? There's Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. We know he wrote it in 58 BC, very specific. Our earliest copy is 900 AD. And you can see the rest of the chart, right? The average time between the autograph, and you see the word autograph there, autograph is the technical term, and some people actually pronounce it autographa. I just say autograph because I think it helps us understand, why do we use that word autograph when somebody famous has signed something, right? Well, that's because that we see that they're putting their signature, it's the original signature, right, on the autograph. And so what that is in the technical way that we use it in history is that would be what we call the original document, right? So here's a document that I wrote for myself in teaching, right? So this has got information that I use in my class. This is the original document. This piece of paper is the autograph. On the other side, look at this. Can you see that? This is a typed schedule for a class that I taught. This is typed, so it was printed by a computer. That is not the autograph. That's a copy. Now, because we're in modern times, you and I know it's an exact copy, so it's just as good. But back in the day, back before 1100 AD for sure, that was never the case. So you always had a question of, well, what errors are in there? And so the average span of time is about 1,000 years. And you can see for most of our works of antiquity, it's a pretty thin line. For some, it's worse, right? Levy and Tacitus in particular are two of our most important Roman historians. And unfortunately, their massive works, Tacitus' Histories, Levy's Roman History, we only have a few copies. We don't have the full work. We know it exists because we know from other sources how many volumes were written, but we don't have them. It's a tragedy, right? We would love to find those as historians. So there's always kind of a question of like, how strong can we trust the document? Now, based on what I've said to you earlier, you might not be surprised that the two leading, or three, better way to say it, leading documents in trustworthiness are religious ones. So Homer's Iliad, which you and I may think, well, you may think this for all three of these, that these are just fictional literary works. I would tell you that all three are actually historical works with which they are perhaps give us questions to ask about some of the stories that were told. But we use them historically because, again, they give us this depiction, in Homer's case, of Mycenaean Greek, the old Greek world under Mycenaean, the Minoan time period. The Old Testament, I probably should change that and say really the Jewish Bible, the Jewish testaments, the Jewish writings, which the Jewish people constructed, and then the Christian writings, which we call the New Testament, or is called the New Testament. And in all three cases, you can see the number of manuscripts is extraordinarily high. And actually for the New Testament, the actual number is about 26,000 manuscripts. I only have the 5,000 number there because I'm comparing it to the Iliad, and that's the Greek. So the copies of the New Testament we have written in Greek, we have about almost 6,000, the Iliad 1,800. And again, go back here to this prior chart. For Plato, 210 copies, for Tacitus, 31 copies, Herodotus, 100 copies, Euripides, 9 copies. But we don't really think that somehow when you read Euripides that you're not reading an accurate work. We just understand that it's not as strong as when you read Homer or the New Testament or the Jewish Bible. What you're reading, we are very, very confident. Scholars have worked to reconstruct the original. And this, as historians, gives us great confidence. We would say most works in antiquity that you read, we would say are 85%, 90% reliable. Let me stop there for a second. When I say reliable, again, we're not talking in any of these documents to suggest that someone has inserted lies, or we would say fake news today. It's that as scholars, when we study them, there's times when the documents leave us with questions. Like there's times when it's not clear, I mentioned a sentence being excluded. Well, maybe sometimes there was an addition that was added in. Maybe there was a certain spelling of a city that in some documents of what's supposedly the same thing are spelled differently. So we're kind of working our way through trying to understand what are these differences. So you have people say, oh, there's errors, or it's not reliable, it's not 100% reliable. We're not really talking about, oh, you can't trust that document. It's that when we're trying to say, what did Tacitus actually write, we feel like when you read it, 90% we believe really strongly. It's maybe the 10% where we're not sure. And let me show you a copy of, so you guys know my second degree is in theology and writing. It's from seminary. So these two books here, sorry. This book is actually the New Testament in Greek, which I can somewhat read. It's the Scholar's edition. If you were reading Tacitus, if you were reading Julius Caesar, somewhere there's a Scholar's edition, which you're not going to buy on Amazon. It costs too much, and sometimes it's even hard to find, right? And so when the scholars are working on that, they end up, I'll come back to these in a minute. Whoops, I'll go ahead, I'll come back. They begin working and they write the document in a way that expresses the questions that they have. So just for instance, right here on this right-hand section is a page from the Gospel of John in chapter 8. And I just picked this randomly. And if you can see of the top part, there's this line right here in the middle. And what this is showing is this is verse 3 to verse 12 of the Gospel of John chapter 8. And the bottom 2/3 of this page is a whole bunch of other what looks like gibberish. And this is where the scholars are telling each other their questions about the document, about whether it's something that they think that they've got a difference, and do they feel confident about it, and they feel good about it, like, yeah, we're sure this is the right thing, or there's places where like, well, we're not totally sure. And at least for the Bible, and I think this is what textual scholars do for all of them, is they rank them. They'll say, hey, we've got these debates. and we think this is the right different, so there's some questions about a misspelling perhaps, and what we've chosen is this, and we've graded it as A being we're most confident, all the way down to D, meaning we don't really know. We're not certain. The evidence is not clear enough for us as we're building it. And so over on the screen, you can see this other page that comes from this book that I have, which is a commentary that the scholars write about why did they say what they said here. So again, I'm not expecting you to understand all that. I just want you to see how deep it goes when the scholars are kind of working their way through, what they're trying to decide. And normally, a rule of thumb that we have is the burden of proof falls on the historian, meaning we give the document the benefit of the doubt. We don't suggest, just because something may seem slightly off, or even though we're not certain about the spelling, that somehow we think that there was some nefarious action happening that then causes us to say, well, I'm never going to read Machiavelli again. I'm not going to read the Gallic Wars. I can't trust that Caesar wrote that. No, it's not saying that. We go the other direction. And then we're looking to see, are there moments in some of the document copies that we have that may lead us to question passages of it. So again, both in Homer and in the Bible, there are places where there are some verses or some sections that scholars are not convinced was written by the original author. So in that case, I just showed you the book of John. There may be some verses that people say, I don't think John wrote that when he wrote it. And that's a whole different conversation about John or about Homer or about Tacitus. But I just want you to understand kind of what the scholar is doing. But most of the time, those are very, very few and far between and never have anything to do to impact the narrative. We're almost running out of time, but I wanted to show you kind of how we consider judging a single document. And what we do is we're using other information, so that corroboratory evidence, such as archaeological evidence, writings from another source that mentions the same time period. If a certain document mentioned a certain ruler in a certain time period, and yet there's 4 or 5 other documents that suggest the ruler happened in a different time period, those are the moments that historians begin to wonder about the first document. And there's questions you begin to ask and investigations that you do to try to understand. One of the things that we do is we can begin, particularly with the books that have a significant volume, like Homer's Iliad, you can imagine we find copies throughout Europe, or in some cases throughout the world. So imagine we found a copy of Homer or from something that was written supposedly in 150 BC, right? So we know that there's a thing written, but we find copies, one in Northern Europe, one in modern day Iraq, basically, and one over in Spain, right? And they're in different time periods. Well, what scholars do is they can begin to trace backwards, and they look for common, is there a certain word that was spelled a certain way? Is there a certain phrasing that was used in a certain section that maybe doesn't happen in another section? And ultimately, for instance, here what I'm trying to show you is as an example that these 2 copies, I'm just making this up, but just as an example, ultimately go back to one older copy that we would have, and we could say, oh, look, there's this one older copy in 900 AD found in Italy that was the parent of these 2 copies, but this one over here found in Spain, it goes back to an older version found in North Africa. Well, man, all that's ultimately just, I'm trying to help you understand, how do we know anything from antiquity? So historicity is discovered by the number of manuscripts and guided and supported through archaeology. There's been several times. So in the Bible, the New Testament, for instance, you may know the Gospel of Luke. Well, Luke is actually an amazing first century historian. And even if you weren't a Christian at all, if you wanted to understand the Roman Empire in the Palestinian area, so the eastern part, you should go to Luke first. You should read the Gospel of Luke in his second volume, the Acts of the Apostles. And there's so much information that you can glean about Rome and the Roman Empire from Luke, right? So, but there's been people who've said, oh, certain rulers that he's mentioned those weren't the right rulers or not in the right place. So maybe Luke is a made up name. Maybe that's not a guy. Archaeology has actually gone the other direction. And in fact, archaeology over the past 100 years, but certainly the past 40 years, has just found amazing discovery after amazing discovery. I love watching on my Netflix account and my Disney Plus account archaeological stories, because that's not my field, but it kind of gives that, again, that underpinning for the historical narrative. And when we find new information, what we discover is that the historical narrative that we've known all along is actually right on the money. We feel really, really good about it. And so it gives us the confidence. When I say that the average work of antiquity has a purity of 80 to 90%, again, I don't want you to think, well, we just can't trust what Herodotus wrote. To the contrary, what we find, the more we study and the more information we find through archaeology, is the narrative of the human is actually very, very secure. That's very encouraging when you do then look, as I said, at what lessons can we glean for our own day, right? From the human as a species. What can we see about us, and use that to live our lives and to make good laws and to kind of come up with good decisions. The historian's job is not to obviously make policy, but to recreate that narrative and to maintain a humility, knowing that we're never going to get all the story. We're never going to have the 100%. There's always going to be that adage of the victors write the history. They absolutely do. We always know that every person, is always coming from a perspective. We might say a slant or a bias. And so that's always going to color what they provide for us. Herodotus did, Tacitus did, Josephus did, Carl Kriesman does, if I write history. And so what the historian has to do is she has to work to refrain from trying to add factors or assumptions into the narrative. Again, that kind of idea of always saying, as best we know the evidence. And it's with this information that we're able to get then to this place where we can say, this is the foundation for our society. What lessons can we learn? And that's what we'll do next time. We'll dig into both what does it mean to say something as a civilization? What are some factors that the West brings to this story? And what are lessons that we can take throughout the globe's history that I at least believe are very helpful for us in understanding the role and the society of the human. And again, all this is foundational. We talk about the Civil War, we talk about things happening in the French Revolution, we talk about the Reformation, as we've talked about it in our times together. All that's based on this foundation of who we are as a people. And that's why I love history. History is a beautiful story, and I'm glad and love the fact that you are interested in it. Well, that's our time for tonight. Again, thank you so much for being here with us. And come back next week, bring some of your friends back, or have them join, look for Becca's email to join from their homes if they feel better about it. I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
You too. Thank you, Carl. That was fascinating. Very interesting.
Excellent, excellent.
Thank you.
Be safe, everybody.
You too.